Okay. Hello. Hello and welcome to the keynote lecture by Anjan Chatterjee. My name is Ken Paller. I'm the chair of the program committee, and I'm going to introduce Professor Chatterjee momentarily. But first, a couple other notes. First, to declare the meeting open, for example. I'd like to formally welcome everyone here. That includes all of you here to attend the 22nd annual meeting of the Cognitive Neuroscience Society that's starting today and ends Tuesday at 3:30. So far, we have 1,400 people registered, which is good, and that number will go up in the next few days. But I also want to welcome members of the public that are here just for this talk, the Open to the Public talk. I think there's some of you. Are there some that are not members and are here for the good? There are. Great. So welcome to you, too. And we're really happy to have you here. You know, given how essential public funding is for scientific research, of course, we want to share our scientific insights not with other scientists only, but also with members of the public at large. And so today's keynote lecture is one example of that. Supplements all the other ways scientists share research findings broadly, such as through the work of, for example, our CNS publicist, Lisa Munoz, and the blog on our CNS website, and all the other things like that. Now, for those of you attending CNS in its entirety, we hope you enjoy the program, and I know many of you have been attending the annual meeting for many years, so you know the drill, but I'd like to point out a few new features we have for this year. One is we selected the 9 mini-symposia based on input from the society members, and this was done by putting all the 25 submitted proposals online so that people could read them and decide which ones they wanted to see on the program and vote accordingly, so that we crowdsourced the decision process a little bit this year for the first time. And in fact, the most popular proposal, the one on the control of memory retrieval, we moved to a slot on Monday afternoon. But this first time, not everyone realized about the voting process or didn't open your emails about it. So we hope to publicize that a bit more, and next year have even more votes so the program can really reflect the membership's preferences for topics. Second, for this year, I guess this is the first time that we're going to have 2 sessions that are called Data Blitz sessions, and this provides an opportunity for more people to present their work to an audience, and it gives a wide-ranging sample of interesting research in cognitive neuroscience. So come and hear those talks. Each one is supposed to be just 5 minutes long, and which is not an easy thing to do, but each speaker who actually succeeds in making their talk fit within 5 minutes will get a special prize, a free burrito. So please come along for these quick snippets of current research and see who wins, and there'll be a lot of fun. Now, third, we have some new plans that I wanted to tell you about for electing committee members for the Society. And that reminds me of this song, to paraphrase the famous songwriter Leonard Cohen. We could say, democracy is coming to the CNS. And so I'd like you to stay tuned for that. There should be an email you'll get in the next week or two about how to be nominated for one of the open posts on the various committees and serve helping the program to get put together. And so later on, a few months later, we'll have a voting process so you can vote for the people on these committees. Now, as you know, if you looked at the program, this year's conference has many exciting talks. It has today's DCC talk by Marta Kudis, tomorrow's Miller Prize talk by Patricia Kuhl, 2 Young Investigator Award talks, 3 general symposia, 9 mini-symposia on more specific topics, a few workshops on grants and journal reviewing, 2 Data Blitz sessions, and the 7 poster sessions that are always so well liked at CNS meetings. And a note about CNS for 2016, mark your iCals, it'll be next year at the Hilton in New York City from the 2nd to the 5th of April. Okay, so now on to the keynote talk, The Neuroscience of Aesthetics and Art by Anjan Chatterjee. So there's a nice bio and summary here on page 5 of your program, so I recommend having a look at that, but let me give you a brief bit of background for the talk. Anjan received his MD from Penn and was a neurology resident at the University of Chicago and also completed a behavioral neurology fellowship at the University of Florida with Ken Heilman. His first faculty position was at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and in 1999, he moved to Penn, where he is the Elliott Professor of Neurology and the Chief of Neurology. His extensive publication record covers many topics in behavioral neurology and cognitive neuroscience. That includes patient studies of alien hand syndrome, of neglect, anosognosia, aphasia, frontotemporal dementia, and more. And then a few years ago, it seemed to change a bit, and something else happened, and some of his papers started touching on new topics like how brain damage can influence making art, and then other aspects of aesthetics. And so what does neuroscience have to say about art? Anjan's expertise in neurology and cognitive neuroscience makes him uniquely qualified to talk about the neural underpinnings of art, and he's been trailblazing this new field which is called neuroaesthetics, and it's the topic of his talk today, as well as his 2014 book called The Aesthetic Brain, not to be confused with his other 2014 book, aptly called The Roots of Cognitive Neuroscience, Behavioral Neurology and Neuropsychology. So I'd highly recommend both books. I wish they were on sale just out in the lobby, but I think they're available downstairs in the Oxford publication part of the exhibit hall. So to carry on the metaphor of that second book, I suppose today we'll be hearing about how the foliage and blossoming of art can be understood by considering the relevant roots of it all in neuroscience and neuropsychology. So please join me in welcoming Professor Chatterjee for his keynote address.
I'd like to thank Ken for that terrific introduction and the organizers for inviting me. Ken mentioned that this, somewhere along the way in my CV, that there was a slight shift in some of what I was working, and this art stuff started to creep into my publications. While I'm not going to tell you the story of how that happened, I can tell you it started out from a barroom conversation that led into this whole field. So I would encourage you to spend time in bars and think of different ways that you might expand your horizons. I'm also heartened when I look out here. I'm reminded, Ken mentioned that I did my fellowship with Ken Heilman at the University of Florida. And during that fellowship, it was 1991 that I first went to the Summer Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience that Mike Gazzaniga had started. I think it was maybe the second year. I'm not sure. The historians of the society would have to tell me. But I think Mike and Patty were among the organizers. I don't remember who else were among the organizers. But there was a kind of a sense of excitement about cognitive neuroscience. That particular year, there was a week on attention and a week on emotion. And in the entire 2 weeks, there was not one fMRI talk because fMRI didn't exist. And so just to point out to some of the students, there was cognitive neuroscience before there was fMRI. But there was this kind of excitement about this, the way in which biology and psychology were coming together. And I would like to suggest, and maybe it's a fantasy, but I would like to suggest that there is a kind of excitement right now in the way that cognitive neuroscience and certain aspects of the humanities, in this case aesthetics, might come together. And there is a sense, I think, where we are at a kind of tipping point with neuroaesthetics. And what I will hope to do by the end of this talk is convince many of you that this is an area that is wide open and that there are a number of questions, there are low-hanging fruit that need to be addressed, and that you, hopefully, will be the ones to start answering those questions. So moving along, so some of you probably recognize this person on the screen. Many of you don't. And you might wonder why in a talk about aesthetics am I starting with the picture of such a dour-looking guy? And there are really two things about him. This is Gustav Fechner, for those of you who don't recognize him. He wrote, in 1860, he wrote a book called The Element of Psychophysics. He's one of the founders of experimental psychology. And the main point about his approach to psychophysics was that there were systematic and lawful relationships between things in the world and what happened with respect to our mental appreciation of those things in the world. Right? Many of you probably know Fechner's law, which suggested that there's a relationship between how people experience stimuli and what the magnitude of stimuli in the environment. Okay, so this was an important step in experimental psychology, but at the time he also speculated about an inner psychophysics. So he talked about this as being an outer psychophysics, and he speculated that there must also be an inner psychophysics in which the biologic properties of our brains would have a systematic relationship with our mental lives. But he recognized at the time that we didn't really have the capacity to really address this inner psychophysics, and I would suggest that in some ways the whole realm of cognitive neuroscience is really a kind of expression of what Fechner could only imagine. And the second point about Fechner is that he, in 1874, published a book that is called The Primer, at least in English it's referred to as The Primer of Aesthetics. And this was the first systematic treatise of empirical aesthetics. Now, there had been some people before him who were concerned with biology and how it might relate to aesthetics, most notably Edmund Burke. But Fechner was the first person who really systematically wrote about this, and he referred to this as an aesthetics from below. And by that, he meant that this could be an empirical science, it could be a data-driven science, as opposed to what he called an aesthetics from above, which is what we generally think of as philosophic aesthetics, the kind of argument from first principles. And he thought that if you approach this field from below, at some point it would have to meet the kinds of ideas that came from above, and at that meeting, either there would be some tensions or there would be some resolutions, but it would be a fruitful way to go to do this empirical aesthetics from below. And so where we are right now with neuroaesthetics is a kind of realization, I think, of both of these ideas, that there could be an inner psychophysics, that there might be something that is lawfully related between our mental states and the biology of our brain, and that this could also be put in the service of understanding aesthetic experiences and aesthetic principles. So having said that, the structure of this talk, it's a menu with 5 courses. We'll first talk about beauty. It's very hard if you talk about aesthetics to not mention beauty. There are rarefied circles in which beauty is considered passé, and it's considered hopelessly naive to talk about beauty. Nonetheless, I'm not one of those people. I like beauty. And if you do surveys of people in general and ask them to associate terms with aesthetics, beauty is the word that people associate the most. And then I'll talk a little bit about the aesthetic gaze. This is something that the art historian Gombrich talked about as the beholder's share, that in these contexts that when one is looking at objects, aesthetically or aesthetic objects, that you bring along, that you are a participant in this activity and not simply a passive viewer, and what does neuroscience have to say about that? Then I'll refer to some ideas of what the aesthetic experience is. This is a fundamental question of what is this thing that we might call an aesthetic experience. And then I'll turn a little bit to what is a paradox, and here I'll draw on neurology and neuropsychology. And there's a curious paradox in patients in the context of producing art, where when people have brain damage, in some instances, their art actually gets better. It's a very bizarre thing. If you think about other complex cognitive systems, like language, emotion, decision-making, one is hard-pressed to think of a complex system in which brain damage can actually improve these. And so the question is, what does that mean? What is that telling us about the nature of artistic production? And then finally, I will talk about evolution. And this, of course, is not something that can be verified experimentally. But what I will argue is that the way most people, most scholars have talked about evolution of art, these very weird things that we label as art, have fallen in one of two lines of thought, And I would like to argue that neither of those are particularly satisfying. And the key to understanding why neither of those are understanding will come from a small bird that's bred in Japan. Okay, so to start, these are some kind of framing sorts of notions that we need to get clear. So the first is aesthetics and art are not the same thing. One can have aesthetic experiences of things that are not art. If you like taking quiet walks on the beach at sunset, right, that might be an aesthetic experience, but it's not art. And that there might be art concerns around art that are not aesthetic per se. And then beauty falls within this in the sense that beauty is, the experience of beauty is always within the realm of what one might regard as aesthetics, but it doesn't always have to do with art. In fact, much of contemporary art really doesn't care very much about beauty at all. But on the other hand, there's a lot of art that is concerned about beauty. So I think just in terms of keeping clear the various domains in which these topics arise, keeping this Venn diagram in mind is worthwhile. This is a kind of general framework that I published with Ocean Vartanian in Ticks. And it's the kind of idea that will be very familiar to most cognitive neuroscientists, which is how do you take this complex domain and parse it out in its component parts, and then you start trying to understand different pieces of this. And so you can think of this as having what we've referred to as a core aesthetic triad, which has a sensory motor component, and what are the properties of that, has a kind of evaluation emotional component, and then that also has a knowledge or meaning or semantic kind of component. And the antecedents to this sort of framework come from something I'd written about 10 years ago, trying to think of what the cognitive neuroscience of aesthetics might be like. Around the same time, that was in 2004, a psychologist named Helmut Leder also wrote an information processing model of what the aesthetic experience might be like. And more recently, many of you know Art Shimomura has also talked about this kind of triad. So this is really, this way of thinking about it has its antecedents, but I think it serves as a useful heuristic when you're thinking about how one might approach aesthetics. Okay. So starting with beauty. And to start with, most of what I'm going to talk is about vision, visual objects, objects of visual beauty, and visual art. This is not to say that this domain of inquiry is restricted to visual art. There is interesting work going on in the literary arts right now. There's certainly very interesting work going on in music. Some of you may know some of the work of Bob Zattori, among others, that is really quite interesting. There's interesting work going on in dance. I think I see Beatrice Calvo-Marino here, Emily Cross. These are people who've done, I think both of them are at this meeting. If you're interested in dance, you should go find them and talk to them, because I'm not going to talk about dance. So starting with the visual beauty, faces are in some ways the paradigmatic object in which we think of as being beautiful or not so beautiful, and have various opinions on who looks attractive and who is beautiful and who is not. It turns out that there are three parameters in general, three parameters that seem to contribute to what people find beautiful in faces. And the first of these was actually discovered somewhat serendipitously. This was discovered by Francis Galton, who many of you may know that he was very active at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. He was a polymath. He's an anthropologist, an explorer. He was one of the first psychometricians. He was a statistician, brilliant guy. who was also a eugenist. And in that process, he had these ideas that the physiognomy, the way people's faces looked, might tell us something about their character. And we have remnants of this even now. This is not such an odd notion. People have ideas of a weak chin or a dominant brow. So this is at least some of the elements of that kind of thinking still exist. But he thought what he could do was that if he took faces of criminals, of convicts, and combined them together, he could then produce the prototype face of the criminal, the mastermind, right? That this is what he would get. And he did this, but instead of coming up with Moriarty or someone like that, what he ends up with is actually a very attractive looking person. And what he found was that, that if you averaged faces, that usually the averaged face, and so I should be clear, by average face we don't mean average in some general sense, but the averaging of the parameters of what constitutes a face. So like the size of the eyes, the distance of the eyes from each other, the distance of the nose to the lips, and so on and so forth, that if you averaged those features across a group, that the average face almost always is regarded as more attractive than any of the individual faces that contributes to that face. And there's a kind of biology story to be told about that, which I won't get into, but you can think about that in the context of sort of genetic mixings. We often have a kind of a common sense notion that seems to be prevalent right now, which is that children of mixed heritage often tend to be quite attractive. There's that kind of sensibility around this. The second parameter that seems to be quite consistent is, and this was, I'm sorry, to show that that Galton's idea has been also shown more experimentally more recently with quite good experimental methods. The next parameter that contributes to facial beauty is symmetry. And this is one that seems to also be quite consistent. As a footnote, I should say that if it's absolutely symmetric in the sense that a pure mirror image, that gets a little creepy. People don't find that attractive, right? But just shy of that, the more symmetric faces are, people tend to find those as attractive. And this also has a kind of historic antecedent, which is in the makeup industry. So Maximilian, let me see if I get the name right, Maximilian Faktorowicz was a Polish-Jewish immigrant in the early part of the 20th century to the US who became the cosmetologist to the stars. And he quite cleverly converted his name to Max Factor, which has to be one of the all-time great names if you got a business, right? To be Max Factor, right? So Max Factor, this is a picture of Max Factor. He was the cosmetologist to the stars, and he came up with this beauty micrometer, which was this cage-like structure that would be put on heads, mostly women stars. This is an image of a Hollywood star named Marjorie Reynolds at the time. And the claim is that there are more than 300 of these sort of scaling things that could be moved up and down on the face. And what his idea was that you could detect, using this kind of precise measurement, you could detect minor asymmetries that might not even be visible to you, but that they could cover up with makeup. And under this notion, or implicit in this idea, is that there might be things that are below the level of someone's conscious perception that would still have an influence on how people think of them with respect to beauty. And that turns out might actually be true. So, and then the final of the three characteristics that are associated with beauty has to do with what makes men and women different from each other. Okay? And so this is the notion that the sorts of characteristics that are associated with the effects of estrogen, versus the effects of testosterone on people's facial features. And in this context, we should be very clear that most of these studies are done in the context of heterosexual orientation, and that the kinds of characteristics that men find attractive in women and women find attractive in men. And that these kinds of characteristics can also be exaggerated. So when you think about cartoons, when you think of comics, these are the kinds of, particularly the sexual dimorphic features, are what tend to be exaggerated. They're also exaggerated in supermodels. That the characteristics, when you look at what supermodels look like, they are exaggerated versions of what one expects, for example, in women with the effects of estrogen on people's facial features. Okay, so those are the kinds of parameters that seem to be consistent, and they seem to be consistent across cultures. It turns out that even infants orient to these kinds of faces that adults regard as more attractive, and people in different cultures seem to share a fair amount of these sorts of biases when they're trying to decide what looks attractive. Okay, so what's the neural basis? What's the neural markers for these kinds of, for attractive faces? So this first study is a study that we did some years ago. I did it with Jeff Aguirre, and it was in the context of using faces. This is an fMRI experiment. People came in where there were two separate sessions. In one session, they were judging the identity of faces, and in the other session, they were judging attractiveness of faces. And what we find is, and for this particular study, we were very focused on the back of the brain, parts of visual cortex, and we had functionally identified areas like the FFA. These are areas that are very sensitive to faces, PPA, areas that are sensitive to places, and adjacent areas. And when people were making judgments of faces, of whether they thought they were attractive, we got a distributed network of areas that varied parametrically with how attractive the faces were. So parts of parietal cortex, some of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, parts of insula. But for this, what I'd like to focus is on what's happening in visual cortex in the context of this. And what we found was that there was neural activity as measured by the bold signal. There was increased activity in the FFA, which is the fusiform face area, parts of the brain that are responsive to faces, and adjoining areas, area LO for the neuroscientists in the room, but not in parts of the brain that were sensitive to places, suggesting that this is not a generalized effect, but something more specific. Even more interesting was in the condition where people were making judgments of identity, right? So the question of attractiveness is not on the table. They're making judgments of identity. We don't get all of the cortical, sort of the convexity kinds of activations in parietal cortex and parts of prefrontal cortex. However, in visual cortex, we continue to see that neural activity varies parametrically with attractiveness of these faces. Now, these people aren't thinking, at least as far as we know, aren't thinking actively about the attractiveness of faces. And one implication of this is that implicitly, within visual cortex, that our brains are responding to this kind of beauty regardless of what the task is at hand. That we're always responding. It's sort of almost as though this is a face beauty detector that's always going off regardless of what we're doing. Now, for technical reasons, in our study, we didn't have very good signal in parts of the brain that are associated with rewards. So these are in parts of the frontal cortex, orbitofrontal cortex, and parts of areas that are referred to as the ventral striatum that across many studies are associated with pleasure and rewards. But there have been other studies that have done similar things, and this is one study where I'll just focus on the one result, which is in what they're referring to as the implicit condition. This is where people are making a judgment of the shape of the face. Right? So in our implicit condition, they were judging identity. Here they're judging the shape of the face. And the faces vary depending on how attractive they are. And what they find is that even in this implicit condition, there is neural response that varies parametrically with how attractive the faces are in both the ventral striatum, this is the nucleus accumbens, and parts of orbitofrontal cortex. So this is low in the base of the frontal lobes, right above where the eyes are. That's why it's referred to as orbitofrontal. The other thing they find is that they model the data for an immediate response within the first second of the image is showing, and a later response, and that they showed that the response in these two areas are different. That in the nucleus accumbens, the response is immediate, and it's only immediate if this is the first time they have seen these faces. Since they counterbalance the sessions, they don't see this response in the second time. Right? So there's a combination of both the novelty of the faces and the immediate response in which you get this nucleus accumbens activity. And in the medial orbitofrontal cortex, you get a response that comes later. And so what they suggest, and for people in here who do neuroeconomics work or decision-making work, this whole notion of what's happening between the nucleus accumbens and the orbitofrontal cortex is a live issue. But what they suggest is there's this immediate response that we have a reflexive response to people's attractiveness that is instantiated in the nucleus accumbens. And this might have something to do with expectancy, and that there is a later response that might have something to do with kind of accounting for attractiveness and maybe sort of setting up for various kinds of choices that someone might make. So the point about this is it emphasizes something about aesthetic responses, which is that they're also dynamic, that there is something that changes over time, and that itself becomes a kind of a set of questions that so far have not been really addressed to any great extent. So in talking about this, we've been emphasizing the sorts of parameters and the kind of responses that typically are common across people. But generally, when you look at behavioral studies, there is also a fair amount of variability, right? Some people find certain kinds of faces attractive, other people find them not as attractive. And across different studies, the correlation across individual people when they're judging faces tends to be anywhere from, in terms of how much variance is accounted for, can be anywhere from 20 to 50%. Right? So what that's saying is the shared amount of communal agreement on these faces, depending on who you're looking at and where you're studying, tends to be in that range. And so another question is there a way in which we can get a neural signature for what makes people different about how they respond to faces? Can individual variability or some kind of variability also be captured? And so this is a study that Ocean Vartanian did. It was a study in which they used a much greater range of faces than have typically been used in this kind of research. So they varied by age. They varied, there were naturalistic images, and what they found was when they looked at the shared variance, so what people found in common, they got the kinds of patterns that other people had reported, but they also noticed that some people in this group tended to be quite strict raters. They didn't think anybody looked good, right? And that there were some people that tended to be quite liberal. Everybody looked hot to them, right? So what they do is they divide these into these two groups and look at a subtraction of this, and the area in which they find activity for this subtraction is in the right hemisphere, in the temporal cortex, and parts of posterior middle temporal gyrus for people who are interested in this. And it's not exactly clear what is going on, and they're not sure what's going on with this area. In the left hemisphere, parts of posterior middle temporal gyrus and middle temporal gyrus in general is very important for various aspects of semantics. But on the right, there is some sense that this is a convergence zone where information from many different kinds of information come, and perhaps it has something to do with our aspects of social cognition, and maybe this is there's a way in which this is playing into how people are making these kinds of judgments. Okay, it's a pure reverse inference, but I bring this up simply to talk about the fact that there are ways in which one can start to ask questions about variability in the same way that one typically asks questions about universality when people are doing imaging studies. Now, so we've talked about faces, but this kind of response to beauty is not, of course, confined to faces. This is a study that we recently published in PNAS looking at architectural spaces. And in the context of this study, we found that people preferred curved spaces rather than very squared off spaces, and that the neural response to that varied parametrically with what people liked was also in this general area somewhere between medial orbifrontal cortex and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Again, parts of the frontal cortex lower down towards the midline. Now, there have been a couple of other studies that are worth pointing out along these lines. These are two worth mentioning. So Semir Zeki, who many of you probably know, is famously coined the term neuroaesthetics back in 1999. He did the study in which he was interested in a kind of question that people who do neuroeconomics ask all the time, which is there a common currency to value, right? Do we translate everything we value into a single kind of currency, and is there anything about the neural signal that might give us a handle on that? So what he did was he took musical pieces as well as artworks, and showed that there was, again, in parts of medial orbifrontal cortex, the same area, that there were areas in which neural response varied parametrically with how attractive these stimuli were, and that they overlapped but were not identical. Okay? And then the other study is, that I have here is a meta-analysis that was done by Steve Brown, where he looked at something like, I think there were over 90 studies in this, 90 imaging studies, in which he looked at people's response to not just vision, or the studies that were published not just for vision, but also for olfaction and for audition, and again found that there's this sort of smearing along orbifrontal cortex for these different kinds of stimuli. Again, this is a meta-analysis, so the methods are very different, and what kind of stimuli people used were very different. But there does seem to be, again, similar but not identical within orbifrontal cortex. And in his meta-analysis, parts of the insula, okay, so this is a slightly different part of the brain that sometimes is associated with objects being salients. There's something referred to as the salience network in which the insula is important. It is also tied to our autonomic nervous system and arousal, that this also seemed to be an area that was affected with what considerable consistency across these kinds of tasks. So this question, so this is a kind of question I would pose to you of what exactly is going on in aesthetic experiences, whether there's a common currency to beauty or not, remains an open question. And I'll point out one more study that came out of Penn. This is just so you know, this is about faces and places. I originally had another image for the place, so it was a landscape, but the organizers of this meeting tweeted about this talk and this morning, and their tweet included this image, which said that come to this talk and you'll find out why you find this image attractive. So I figured I should put it in the talk. I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question. But so Teresa Pigors is a graduate student working with Russell Epstein and did the study with Joe Cable and me. And basically asking this question with, in terms of faces and places, again, looking at these parts of orbitofrontal cortex, is there a common currency to beauty or the pleasure that we get out of beautiful things or not? And what she found, and as in many of these things, the answers are never as simple as one would like. So look at ventromedial prefrontal cortex. She finds that there is parametric variation with there is parametric variation in neural activity to both faces and places. And if you do a direct comparison, it doesn't appear that they are different from each other. Okay, so if you just looked at those kinds of data, you would say, yes, this is consistent with the idea that this part of the brain is responding to beauty in both of these kinds of objects. But then what she did, which up until this paper, unless I'm mistaken, had not been done, which was use the kinds of techniques that have been become more popular in cognitive neuroscience over the last little bit, which is using multivoxel pattern analyses. And so just briefly to tell people who are not in the neurosciences that these are new ways of analyzing data which suggest that if you have a piece of real estate in the brain that is responding to a certain kind of activity, there are ways in which one can analyze those data to say within that region there might be different patterns of activation that can classify different kinds of objects. So it's sort of a convoluted way of saying, sort of a metaphor might be if you think of a house has a certain number of lights on, it's generating a certain amount of energy, right? But you can have different configurations of which rooms have their lights on that would produce the same kind of energy. And this is a way to say, this is a method to say, are the same rooms lit up, producing the same amount of energy, or are different rooms lit up? And what she finds is that in the left ventromedial prefrontal cortex, there is no, that the classifier doesn't work, but in the right it does, suggesting that in the left there might be a kind of common currency to both of these kinds of stimuli, but in the right there is some discrimination going on. Okay, it's getting a little in the weeds, but I bring this up as the kinds of questions that still remain to be worked out in any kind of detail. The other thing she found was in the lateral part of the orbitofrontal cortex, there was an area that responded only to faces. So the lateral OFC, okay, this is just a part slightly off to the side from most of what we've been talking to, turns out to be a rather interesting area that in some studies it seems to respond to beauty, in others it doesn't. It's not clear what's going on. And I'll extend this to one final study in talking about beauty, which is this question of the kind of stereotype we have. So the ancient Greeks thought that there were these three core values, right? Beauty, truth, and goodness. And there is this beauty is good kind of stereotype, which in some instances is a huge pain, right? It's a huge pain because attractive people typically get paid better for the same amount of work. Attractive students get graded better for the same amount of work. If you're a criminal and you're attractive, you get less punishment, right? So, but there is something about this that seems to bleed over between sort of our assessment of something that is good and something that is beautiful. And this is one recent study. There have been several studies. I think Roberto Cabeza did one a few years ago. But this is a more recent study looking at this question of, is there something common about the response to something that might be regarded as morally beautiful, which we would call good, and beautiful in the more typical sense, in this case, faces. And what they find in this lateral orbifrontal cortex area, that there is a specific part that is responsive to both kinds of situations, and at least suggesting that maybe this is the biologic marker, or something like this, where you can start to have one kind of judgment bleed over into the other, and might be the basis for this, this stereotype that can be quite pervasive in everyday life. Okay, so that was kind of a long-winded talk about beauty. I'm going to talk now a little bit about the aesthetic gaze, which I mentioned is part of what Gombrich talked about as the beholder's share. What do you bring when you enter into this kind of encounter? And there is a way in which we are stuck with the specter of Duchamp for the last 100 years, right? So what he did was he said, look, he could put a urinal up and say, this is art, right? And if you take surveys, people will say he was the most influential artist of the 20th century. Not Picasso, not Matisse, Duchamp. And specifically because he completely radicalized the way in which we start to think about art. And this can have all sorts of consequences, where you can have a hunk of lard that can be a piece of art. For those of you who can see the slide, this is a can of the artist's shit. This was sold in 2007 at Sotheby's for 124,000 euros. Serious stuff, right? But the question is, what are we bringing to this that ends up where we give it this kind of value? Okay, so far, I don't know that anybody has done any experiments with these specific stimuli, but there are hints at what might be going on. And this is one example where where Lacey and colleagues used these kinds of matched images, where there were photographs of scenes, and then the same content of the photographs were rendered in a way that seemed to suggest that they might be artwork. And what they find in a direct contrast is that in the images that tended to be regarded as artwork, that there were certainly parts of visual cortex that had greater activity. But again, when you get to the front of the brain, in parts of the nucleus accumbens and orbifrontal cortex, you have greater activity for these art-like images. Here's another even more dramatic example, which is that here people are looking at the exact same image, right? These are abstract images. They're looking at the exact same thing, and they're being told either the image was generated by a random computer program, or that the images are hanging in a gallery. Okay? They're looking at the exact same thing, and what they find in this experiment is that in the context of when the images are thought to be in a gallery, you have greater medial orbifrontal cortex activity. And in addition, you have some parts of temporal cortex, medial temporal cortex, which they again infer might have to do with drawing on people's memories and their sort of general knowledge. But the point being that when people think that this is in a gallery, they have greater activity in parts of the brain that we assume, based on these kinds of reverse inferences, has something to do with pleasure. So context and framing is important in how we experience pleasure. And then one other, as part of the beholder share, I see that Alumit Ishai is here, so this is a study that she did. She's been quite interested in how people view ambiguous images in artwork. And in this study, what they did was look at various cubist paintings in which objects might be hard to identify. And the point about this study, at least the point I would like to make, which might not be the point that she wants to make, but the point I would like to make is that with a very short training, about 30 minutes of training, of how one should look at this and how objects might be embedded in a cubist painting, that people started to look at these images differently, that they're able to identify more objects, and that with that there was an accompanying neural signature that was different. And most notably, what they find is in parts of, again, parts of ventral visual cortex, in parts of the parahippocampal area that have sometimes been associated with making a set of associations, that there's greater activity in this part of the brain when people are looking at objects after a very short period of training. And at least this suggests, it's a small step to suggest that people can be trained to look at art and look at art differently. And one might infer that people can also be trained to some extent to developing taste. So now coming to this core question, right? So there's the beholder's share, that you come in, you bring something to the table when you're looking at either objects aesthetically or you're looking at artwork. So what is the experience? What's this fundamental experience that's happening that we seek when we go to museums, for example? And this, I would like to suggest, is going back to Fechner, when he talks about aesthetics from below meeting aesthetics from above. I would like to suggest this is not something that can be empirically adjudicated, right? I think this is something that you have to take a stand on what you think that experience is, and then you can start to determine what the neural correlates of that are. So there are three ideas that I would like to propose here based on the kind of work people have done. So one idea is that when we're engaged with artwork, that our bodies are engaged in it, right? So this is the sort of the general popularity of notions of embodied cognition and its sort of neural child, the mirror neuron hypothesis, and the people that are best known for promoting this view are Vittorio Gallese, who's one of the co-discoverers of the mirror neurons with Rizzolatti, and he's teamed up with an art historian named David Friedberg, and they've been pushing this idea that the experience of artwork is embodied in some ways, and this is part of what the aesthetic response is to artworks. And what I'd like to suggest is I think that's true to some extent, but with certain limits. So the first study, this is under preparation. This is something that we've done in my lab, but it's a neat little study. It's a behavioral study. This is the primary author is Diana Rosalera, who's here in the audience. So this is a study in which people are looking at pairs of faces, and they're making a physical judgment, right? Which face is wider than the other? And the simple observation, although quite remarkable in some ways, is when the target is the less attractive face, and so this is, I should say, this is a mouse tracking study, right? So they've got a mouse in the middle, the two images flash, and they have to just move the mouse to the face that they think is the narrower face or the wider face. I can't remember which way we did it. So, but the point is that when the correct target is the less attractive face, that their hands actually move towards the attractive face before going to the target. They always get it right. That's not a hard task. But they're completely unaware that there's this kind of implicit engagement of their motor system of which they're unaware. So other ways in which the motor system might be involved. This is a rather clever study where people in this study were primed. They're primed to think of the ways in which you hold a paintbrush, either sort of grasping it where you'd have these broad strokes or a kind of pincer thing where you have these very delicate point-like strokes. And so they're primed with these images, and after they've been primed to actually do this stuff, then they're shown a series of paintings that are all pointillistic, And they're primed with one of these kinds of images of how their motor behavior might, how they might act with respect to the priming stimulus. And the basic finding is that when people have been primed to do this very point-like gesture, and they look at a pointillist painting, they actually like it better than if they've been primed to do this sort of broad stroke thing. So there's something even in this short period of a way in which you behave, in a way in which you move your muscles that reflects what the artist was probably doing, seems to make people like those paintings more. And then finally, this is a study that was done by Carla Umilta, along with, again, David Friedberg and Vittorio Gallese, where they're particularly interested in this one painter named Fontana, who has these cuts that are part of his art. And this is a study. This was a study that was looking at a particular electrical signature in the brain that is called the mu rhythm, and specifically looking at mu suppression. So let me explain what that is for people who don't know this. So over parts of motor cortex, there is a kind of idling rhythm, right, that is in the 8 to 14 hertz range, where sort of the brain is sort of idling. And as soon as people begin to start to act, or they move a limb, that rhythm gets suppressed. Okay? So it becomes a useful marker for when people are planning to move, when they're planning to do something. And what they find in this experiment, where they're not actually doing anything, they're just looking at these images, and they're also looking, besides the original Fontanas, these flat images where they're just the lines without that sense of they've been cut. When they look at that, specifically in the high-resolution images of the original, that you get mu suppression. And so what they would like to suggest, or what they would like to infer from this, is looking at these paintings suppresses the rhythm that is sort of a preparation for them to then act. And so part of the experience of looking at this, even though someone's not doing anything, that the system is prepared to engage our motor output. So that's one idea. The second idea is I'd like to highlight. It's a particularly interesting study in my view. This is done by Ed Vessel, Gabriela Starr, and Nava Rubin at NYU. And in this study, it's an imaging study where they took a whole lot of different kinds of paintings. And what they find is when they do behavioral ratings is that people vary all over the place, right? There's no consistency in what people like. And in some ways, this ends up being useful, unlike a lot of the studies that are done with faces, because what they say, the logic is, if people are responding very differently, if you get a common neural response, what you're getting at has nothing to do with the characteristics of the stimuli themselves, right? So this is something that's happening inside people's heads. It doesn't matter what is triggering what's happening in your head versus my head, right? But it's the same thing that's happening in the head. And the main point about this study, which makes it so interesting, is they have people rate the images on a scale from 1 to 4 of how much they like it. And what people typically do in these sorts of analyses is you find areas of the brain that varies parametrically with those kinds of ratings. But what Ed found that was different is that there was a qualitative difference. There was a step function between 3 and 4. So for the images that people said they found the most appealing, that they were most moved by, there was something different that happened in the response to just those images. And what they find is it seems to engage what has come to be known as the default mode network. Right? The default mode network, just to tell people who are not neuroscientists, is something that was discovered about 10 years ago. And again, going back to this idling idea, there's this notion that there are certain networks within the brain that tend to be active when people aren't doing anything. And as soon as you give them a task, that these parts of the brain become less active rather than more active. And there's a lot of work going on with respect to what this actually means, but people think it's a kind of, it's a way in which people are generating thoughts. It might have something to do with mind wandering, right? When you're spacing out, for those of you who part of my talk have been mind wandering, right? This your default mode network that's kicking in. And it's not a bad thing, right? So what these guys, what Ed suggests is that part of a core aesthetic experience might be that even though this is being triggered by an external stimulus, what it does is it kicks you into this kind of internally driven state, and that this might be something that is core to a fundamental aesthetic experience. Okay. And then more recently, there was an MEG study that gives partial support for this idea. And what this study does, again, MEG is a different kind of technology that looks at electrical signals and is better than fMRI, for timing. And what they find is that there are two kinds of responses to beautiful paintings. There's an early response that is earlier than 750 milliseconds, and a later one that's after a second. And the response after a second, when they look at the coherence of the electrical signal, seems to be emanating from what in imaging we would call the default mode network. So they would like to say, yes, there might be something like this, but it's happening. It's not the initial response, it's the later response. Again, many, many questions to be addressed. For example, they find this is primarily on the left. Why on the left? We don't know. Okay. And then the third idea I would like to raise is actually an old one. And this is an old one that goes back to the 18th century and was advocated by both Kant and the Earl of Shaftesbury. And the idea that they introduced was that something that is core to an aesthetic experience is the notion of a disinterested interest. Right? That's the term that is used most commonly with this, that there is a way in which one is engaged, but with a certain kind of psychic distance. And what I would like to suggest is the question is, what is that psychic distance? And can that be cashed out in neural terms? And one possibility is this. This is, some of you may know Kent Berridge, who's at the University of Michigan, who's done some beautiful work looking at reward systems. And what he points out that in the nucleus accumbens, this is based on rodents, is that there are two systems that often work in concert, but really are somewhat distinct. And one of them, which he refers to more colloquially as, distinguishes these as liking versus wanting, that the liking system is cashed out through different neurotransmitter systems, through cannabinoids and opiates, whereas the wanting system is cashed out through dopamine. Right? And so there is a sense in which there is a pure pleasure, and distinct from that is the desire to acquire pleasure. Right? That it seems to be playing out in the system. And so one possibility might be that to translate what these 18th century theoreticians said into contemporary neuroscience with respect to pleasure might be that the aesthetic experience is really liking without wanting. Right? That you can like something without having the acquisitive impulse. So you look at a painting, you really like it, but you're not thinking, oh, I want to buy that, I want to impress my friends with it, this is going to be a good investment. All of those things can co-occur simultaneously, but those are not the quintessential aesthetic experience. And so this raises a question of, is that a generalizable principle that with respect to pleasure plays out the way Berridge suggests, but might this apply to other domains as well? And so I raised this is more of a thought experiment, which is that in general, we've been talking about aesthetic experiences in the context of liking and beauty and pleasure, but aesthetic experiences are not just that. There are many other kinds of aesthetic experiences. And this I give you as an example of one that is typically associated with horror, right? But people go to horror movies, right? People go and they want to be scared, and there's a way in which this is pleasurable. Right? And we don't really understand what's going on with that. But one thing that might be the case, or characteristic of these kinds of experiences, is that even though our motor systems are engaged, as suggested by the early experiments, they're not engaged to the point where you actually generate an action plan. That fundamental to this, to the aesthetic experience, is that you not generate an action plan. Okay? And so, again, as I said, these are kinds of questions that can't be adjudicated empirically. One can stake a claim and say, this is what I think it is, and then try to identify what the neural correlates of those are. All right, so, okay, so I'm going to move somewhat quickly, because I think I've been blathering on too long. So patients, I said, here's this extraordinary thing, that you can have a situation where patients can have brain damage and their art gets better. Absolutely extraordinary. There are virtually no other conditions in which I can think that this happens, maybe for low-level sensory processing. And let me give you some examples. This is Bruce Miller, who's here at UCSF, first reported that there are patients who have frontotemporal dementias. This is a degenerative kind of disorder in which they start now, having never been artists, start to produce artwork. This is another rather well-known example, is a woman, a young girl named Nadia, who was severely, severely autistic. And this is the kinds of drawings that she could do. This is done when she was 3 years old. And this is an example of what she did when she was 5.5. And just to put this in perspective, the image on the left is what a typical child that age does, right? Just so just to really draw out the enormous difference. Probably the most famous artist among the pantheon of artists that continued to paint when he developed Alzheimer's disease, in this case, is Willem de Kooning. And the period in which he had Alzheimer's disease, there was a period about 6 or 7 years where he continued to paint, and he produced these sort of simplified abstractions that some people think were extraordinary. And actually, just a few blocks from here in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, there was a single-person show about these kinds of artworks. And then again, to stay on a local theme, this is a woman named Catherine Sherwood, who's a professor at Berkeley. If some of your students at Berkeley, you might know her. When she was 44 years old, while she was teaching a graduate seminar, she has a large left hemisphere stroke, a hemorrhagic stroke. Right in the classroom, boom, she's down. Right? She had been painting before that, and then after her stroke, after some considerable time of recovery, she starts painting again. And I have a reference here, and the reason I'm using her name so freely is that she uses her name freely, and she has a paper in Frontiers of Human Neuroscience of her own first-person account of what it felt like and what she thinks has changed with respect to her artistic production. And we've looked at her artwork in more systematic ways and how they've changed, and trying to characterize specifically what's changed in her art. But these examples, and there are many more, I could do an entire talk just on these kinds of phenomenon, raise the question of what is going on that you can have brain damage, and in some instances artwork changes, and changes for the better. Now, I want to make this clear. What I am not recommending is that you should get brain damage to improve your artwork. Right? This is not, I'm not making a radical claim like that, but I am saying that in some instances this happens, and we should ask ourselves, why is that? And one way to think about how art works is that the metaphor that we use for what happens in brain damage might be different than what we typically think of. And so on the left is how I think we usually think about it, which is that our cognitive systems are like a house of cards. You get damage somewhere, part of it collapses, part of it might remain, but you always have something that is lesser than the whole. That's the typical way we think of what happens when people have brain damage. But an alternate way might be to think of it as you might a hanging mobile, where you remove parts of it, and sometimes the whole thing collapses. But in some instances, the entire structure might equilibrate in a different way that is that itself is appealing. And for people that are interested in connectivities of the brain and these distributed networks, this is a kind of idea that might be appealing, that the entire system reconfigures in a certain way that isn't necessarily bad. And so you end up with this notion that there is not a single art center in the brain, but that this is a flexible set of parts of the brain that or different parts of the brain are used flexibly to produce art, and that this, to again use Alamit's example, is the sort of thing that can be engaged and socially modulated, right? So this is the kind of, and what I would like you to do is to keep these characteristics in mind, which is that the networks might be flexible, they build on other kinds of components, and they can be socially modulated. Okay, so we're almost done. I'm going to get to the last bit, which is this question of how did these things evolve? Like, why do we have such a thing as art, right? You don't eat it. You don't make babies with it, typically, right? So what's the point of this? And when you look at what people have talked about this, that people fall in two camps, which is people either say it's an epiphenomenon, and there are some certainly intellectual heavyweights taking this position. So Steven Pinker, for example, famously, he was talking about music in this instance, famously referred to this as cheesecake. Right? The idea was that what really drives what the real adaptation is our desire for fat and sugar. But cheesecake is sort of an adaptation of that, not an adaptation, wrong word, is a kind of embellishment of that, which is kind of what art really is. Stephen Jay Gould, for example, thought that anything like art, particularly because it's of such relative recent evolution, really couldn't have much to do with the core adaptation. And he introduced the notion of, some people refer to as exaptation, spandrel, that this is again an epiphenomenon of other important features. On the other hand, there are these other people like Ellen Dissanayake, Dennis Dutton, who is a philosopher who actually recently died in the last couple of years, but he even wrote a book called The Art Instinct, right? So this is really staking the claim that he thinks this is an instinct, and Jeffrey Miller. And there are a couple of ways in which people think about this, which, oh, didn't realize I was behind. So that was, that was what I was just talking about. So if you believe that art is a universal impulse and must be an instinct, you make the argument that wherever you look, there's some form of art. So these are various images in Philadelphia. It doesn't have to be the Philadelphia Museum of Art or the Barnes Foundation. You can look anywhere, and there's this kind of artistic impulse. And you can look anywhere in time, and you see evidence of what seems to be art. And this suggests that this is really a kind of core value, a core instinct that makes us produce art. Okay, so it's worth going back to Darwin and going back to what he said about evolution. And this, even though we hear about it all the time, when you stop and think about it, it's extraordinary, right? It's sort of like gold. The luster never goes away over time. That this idea that there's this very simple recipe, that you have something that replicates, something that in the replication there's a certain amount of contamination, so there's drift, and that there is selection based on something in the environment, and that's all you need, and the whole thing kicks into gear. Right? It's extraordinary when you think about it, of how very complex phenomena can evolve. Now, when people talk about art, everybody's favorite example from zoology is the peacock's tail. And this is something that deeply concerned Darwin because he initially couldn't figure out how this could be an adaptation, right? This thing got in the way, made the peacock not move very well. He was deeply disturbed by this, and this is how he then came up with the second major work, which was the notion of sexual selection as distinct from natural selection. Okay? And so people have taken this idea and said that what art is, when artists are producing their elaborate, useless things, which are sort of like a peacock's tail, what they are doing is they are demonstrating their prowess, and that's the core adaptation. That is underlying what we regard as artwork. There's another kind of idea that is that part of what art does might be an adaptation at a group level and not an individual level. And Ellen Dissanayake is most associated with this. She suggests that the process of making art is really a communal activity. It encourages social bonds, and back in our Pleistocene ancestors, that this was actually useful for groups to be more likely to survive than others. Okay? And the arguments are a little more nuanced than I'm expressing right now, but for our purposes, I think that's worthwhile. So you have these poles, which is either you say art is universal, it's always been there, and it serves these kinds of purposes that we think was probably helpful for survival, or you say it's highly localized, it's highly cultural specific, and it's for its own sake, that there's really no inherent usefulness to this artwork. And the question is, which of these is it? And what I would like to suggest is the problem is that they are both correct and that the question itself is ill-formed. Okay, and what do I mean by that? And for this, I think we'll need to take a step back and go back to this issue of selection. So in Darwin's recipe, there's replication, variation, and selection. And what I'd like to suggest is what happens when selection is increased and what happens when selection is relaxed. Okay, so here's an example from biology of the relaxation of selections. So most mammals have a particular gene that codes for an enzyme that produces vitamin C. Okay? This is something that we need for all sorts of purposes of cellular metabolism. But at some point, this gene started to degrade, and degraded at the same time that primates started to eat fruit. They started to seek out fruit and eat fruit, and so there was an endogenous source of vitamin C, which meant that the integrity of this particular gene was no longer necessary for survival. And so over time, this kind of gene degrades, right? Every time you replicate something, there's a little bit of degradation, right? That's part of the key for evolution, right? But in this case, it degrades, and it's no longer needed for survival. And so the behavior, the necessity for vitamin C is offloaded into other kinds of behavior. Some people think that part of this was also the development of our color vision to better able to identify fruit. And so it's an example in which the function of a single gene is offloaded into behavior because of conditions in which selection is relaxed. Okay, now to the more interesting example for our purposes, as I mentioned, is this little bird. Okay, we're close to the end. I know I've talked for a long time, but this is really the punchline, right? So I want to make sure you get it. Okay, so these are two birds. It's this little bird called on the left is the white-rumped munia. It's a feral bird that exists through much of Southeast Asia, right? And it has its own little song, and like most birds, it uses its song to find mates and so on and so forth. 250 years ago, Japanese collectors started to collect these birds, took them to Japan, and wanted to breed them for color. Okay? So, and over about 200 generations, which is 250 years in these birds' lifespan, they were bred for color. And so what you have is this artificial niche in which their song no longer matters for their survival. Right? So this is the analogy to the vitamin C story. Right? Their song just doesn't matter, and so the song is going to presumably degenerate, but it has no implications for survival, because all that matters for survival is what their feathers look like. This is being done artificially. But the question is, what does happen to their song? Right? The song doesn't, it turn out, just wither away. It actually becomes more interesting. That the song of the Bengalese finch, which is the domesticated bird in whom the song does not matter for its survival, becomes more complex. They learn better. They are more modulated by what's in their environment with respect to their song. And when people look at the neural structure, the neural bases for their song, it's far more distributed across the cortex. When for the feral bird, it's primarily generated out of what the equivalent in the bird is of the basal ganglia. Okay? So what you have now is under conditions in which selection has been relaxed, the behavior becomes more complex, it becomes more flexible, it becomes more socially modulated. And what I would like to suggest is that this, going back to my previous slide, is that this is the nature of what we think are the networks that are involved in art production, right? So it's similar in that way. And then, and to quote William James here, his observation that many of the dynamics that Darwin talked about in the context of zoology also apply to these sorts of social phenomenon. And so going back to saying that the original question of is art an instinct or is it an epiphenomenon, I think is the wrong kind of question, because the question that we should be asking is, what is the nature of art under conditions of selection, high selection, and under conditions of relaxed selection, right? And in the same way that we don't say that the white-rumped munia's song is no longer a song, or that the Bengalese finch's song is no longer a song, it's they're qualitatively different, and that the question of whether or not art represents an instinct, again, I would like to suggest is the wrong question. So my final slide is is sort of an advertisement and in some ways an exhortation to the young cognitive neuroscientists in the audience, which is that there is something about questions in aesthetics that is orthogonal to almost every domain in cognitive neuroscience. Right? You could be a perception psychologist, a perception scientist, or interested in attention. There are ways in which that's relevant to aesthetics. You could be interested in motion. You could be interested in semantics. This applies to aesthetics. Decision making. How do we choose? What's the nature of choice? And finally, applications, which I haven't talked about, with respect to can art be used for therapeutic purposes, and the other practical kinds of implications, what's going on with fashion and design. But I leave this with you to suggest that there are a series of questions that the landscape is sort of starting to come into focus, but what's coming into focus are the questions, not the answers. And I think that it doesn't matter what domain of cognitive neuroscience you find yourself in, there are probably questions that can be addressed, questions about neuroaesthetics that can be addressed, and you're going to be the ones to do it. Thanks.
Okay, I'd like to thank Professor Chatterjee for a wonderful talk, and many have to go to the poster session, but let's still take a few questions from the audience. If you'd like to go to the center microphone, if you don't need to go to the poster session right away, go ahead and we'll take some questions.
Hi, I found it very interesting, and you sometimes almost touched on it, but never quite really touched on it, and that's the processing of valence and arousal, so the emotional aspects of our processing. What, on your view, could you expand a bit on what the relation is of these two aspects of processing and judgments of beauty?
Yeah, so arousal, there's a long tradition of considering arousal in empirical aesthetics. And the person who's often associated with this is Daniel Berline, who wrote a fair amount about it. I think in my mind, there's a question of what happens with salience and arousal, and that can be both in the context of a positive or a negative experience, right? And one question that is completely open is that are there ways in which people can be aroused in a negative sense, right, as a way to predispose people to an aesthetic experience? And so there's at least one study that has looked at this. This is the lead author, or the senior author is Jesse Prince, where people were shown YouTube videos, scary YouTube videos, and they could show that they actually felt scared, and that in that context, that when they were asked to rate various kinds of images, they're much more inclined to talk about the notion of the sublime, which is a big concept which I didn't touch on at all, but that you could induce, you could bias people towards experiencing things as sublime in the context, in that case, a negative valence preceding the image.
Do you think it's a time course difference between those two things? Because so you showed evidence for sort of, aesthetic evaluation being somewhat implicit and almost independent of task. But on the other hand, how can you sort of react to the aesthetics if you haven't processed the valence or something more inherent to the stimulus?
So a couple of things. The question of what happens over the time period of aesthetic experiences and engagement with something is completely wide open. Right? I gave you a couple examples where we're starting to get some hints of it, but it's completely wide open. I think context matters, right? So my suggestion using the Hitchcock movie of you're coming in, it's a movie, right? That already creates a context in which you would look, where you're willing to be aroused. I mean, I might go to a movie that shows a dark alley and really enjoy it in a way that in parts of Philadelphia I might not walk down that dark alley. I'm going to be aroused in both instances, but the question is what's different and what's the critical ingredient that makes one an aesthetic experience and the other just an aroused, scary experience? And I don't know the answer to that.
There's been some research on jazz musicians showing that improvisation is associated with a lack of activity or a decrease in activity in frontal areas involved in inhibition. Do you see that kind of release from inhibition as a general mechanism underlying artistic expression and creativity? Yeah,
it's a good question. Again, there are pieces that I didn't include in the talk. One thing that relates to what you're saying is this notion that you might be able to inhibit parts of prefrontal cortex that exert executive control over parts of the brain in the back of the brain, right? And there have been at least one, perhaps two studies that have used non-invasive brain stimulation to show that if you actually inhibit parts of prefrontal cortex, that what you're doing is that you can change people's ratings of paintings. So these are, again, normal people. Under those circumstances, you can change people's ratings. Now, those are subtle findings, but there probably is something there.
Thanks very much.
Yep.